Sometimes you buy figures based solely on the fact that they're cool looking. This is one such case. Today we're going over a figure from a series I've never watched before, so let's just jump into it. This character is an interesting mech from a series called Mado King Granzort. I don't know too much about the series, and to be completely honest, I couldn't even find anything about this character. I'm not sure if this is an original design or if this was actually in the show. Looking up its name only brings up the figure. And if that's the case, this is a pretty interesting thing. Now, this is from the Variable Action series of Megahouse figures. I've never reviewed or even really dealt with a posable Megahouse figure. I have several of their statues, but I've never went into anything with more articulation. I'm excited to see what kind of quality gets put into this. I already love their other figures, so this should be something just like that, right? Let's find out. And just how awesome is that? Inside of the box, you can actually see Musyametal as a face mode version of the robot in question. We'll talk more about that later, but that is a nice little insert inside the box. He comes with an instruction pamphlet which shows you some of his features, including how to transform him, but we'll get to that later. Inside the plastic, I gotta say, he already looks pretty awesome. And in addition to the figure, you get a bunch of accessories as well, and these look great. Let's get this thing open. And I've gotta say, my first impression of this figure is that it is absolutely amazing looking in hand. The finish on some of the paint on this thing is incredible looking. It really allows it to pop. There's a really nice contrast of all these plain gray parts on the inside being flat and very boring, but then the outer shells are done in sort of a matte and metallic finish as well. You can see that there's a shine to the red and the gold, and even somewhat to this purple, but still the purple actually has some texture, as does all of this very dark navy blue that's all over him. But then in this ground, the back, which I would assume to accentuate metal parts, looks really clean and really shiny. But this entire thing is plastic, I'll say that. But this gets even better once we fully accessorize him, because he does indeed have some assembly required. One immediate criticism that I will give this thing is that he is a bit floppy right out of the packaging. I did buy this figure used, but it looks in immaculate condition, and I will say that I've heard before that the joints on these can be kind of loose, so that may be just something to theme with the rest of this Variable Action series. And I've heard it about other figures from the Granzort line. Now, he has additional horns that plug into his shoulders, so we're going to put those on now. They're just a very simple peg. And I will say that those shoulders do allow him to look quite a bit more menacing. As you can see, his shoulders go up and down on this little hinge right here. Now, that can cause some issues when you're trying to actually pose his arm itself. His arms do have a swivel where they connect at the shoulder, and they're incredibly tight, as you can hear that squeak. They also can go in and out, but it's also very tight, and the shoulder pad really limits that mobility. Now, where the bicep connects to the shoulder, you can actually swivel that as well, and he has a hinge right here at the elbow so that you can bend his arm. Now, he does have a wristlet at the end of his forearm here, and that will allow that to swivel as well, which also has a hand here, which can move just ever so slightly and swivel side to side. This piece here is a bit of a problem. It's cool and all, but it does really limit mobility, especially with the shoulder. Now, his head is kind of a problem because it's actually connected to the mechanism that allows him to transform. And because of that, whenever I try to move his head, it just kind of comes up like this. But you want it to be locked down like that. The good thing is the kabuto on his helmet does move around a bit, so you don't have to worry about that breaking. Now, the jaw on the face of the figure actually moves around, which is kind of funny. The legs have some pretty typical motion. They can go up and down and in and out where they connect. And of course the knee goes in and out just ever so slightly, but it doesn't go completely back. Now the foot is on a ball joint, which allows it to roll around a little bit, but it mostly just gets that up and down for the most part. I will say that his mobility is incredibly limited thanks to the transformation aspect, making him incredibly hard to move around. The main problem is his back plate. This thing constantly comes open and there's no way to lock it into his head. And if you do, it just tucks his face into the front. Weirdly enough, it folds outward, and then that folds his shoulders back, and then you can tuck that in. Now, I'm really reluctant to pose him because it constantly feels like I'm going to break something, so I'm really not liking this right now because this figure is worth a lot of money. I've only been able to find one other one online, and the price for it is astronomically high. This thing was like originally $60 or $70 when it came out, and obviously enough the aftermarket is crazy because there seems to be none of these floating around. But to be honest, if I ever bought this for that amount and I was a huge fan of the show, I would be so scared to break this thing. He comes with these 2 long samurai swords, which he can dual wield. And similarly, he comes with these short blades as well. One cool thing you can do is actually tuck his smaller blade into his shoulder pads. Pretty cool. Luckily, Musyametal comes with a stand here, which is pretty basic. It actually has an arm that connects right here. The arm is rather big and conspicuous, and it almost looks like a crane, so I'm not quite digging this. But at least it seems like it would hold him up. It's a typical tri-hinge stand where it can actually pose at the base, right here in the middle, and of course at the very edge of it as well. And it plugs in right in the rear of the character's, I guess, butt. And despite how cool he looks, I will tell you that this is absolutely the worst figure I have ever posed. This is one of the most difficult figures I have ever tried to articulate, and I absolutely hate it for that reason. You see, the difficulty comes from equal parts fragility and confusion. Because this thing's a transformer, it has a ton of joints that have the ability to move that really don't need to. And because of this, it's constantly bending at places that it shouldn't be. And you're often breaking pieces off without the realization as to whether or not this is just a part that comes off, or if you've actually broken the figure. And for the price tag on this thing, I am so petrified to even continue this review. He comes with multiple hands, but getting him onto him is an absolute nightmare. Moving his arms is one of the worst things about this figure, because the arms are directly connected to a transforming mechanism, and moving them means constantly making the pelvis of the character move in and out because of the ability that it has to move the pelvis forward in order to change the style of the figure. This thing looks amazing, and it's really hurting me to have to already think that I'm going to give it such a bad score. But there's more reasons why. This is one of the multiple hands that he comes with, and of course they're meant to hold his swords. The swords are one of the cooler parts of it, and he is indeed a samurai-looking character, so you would want to make him hold them, right? Well, unfortunately, because of the fact that the hands are so tight, and these swords fit almost exactly in there, there's tons of paint rub that causes you to basically ruin the swords and the hands if you try to plug them in. You can see here by the hilt, there's a bunch of paint missing. You can see that white there, and even some black right here. And looking at the hand shows you inside there a ton of scratched off paint. This is such poor design. These would need to be flexible to be able to hold these without completely ruining them. And another strange thing I've noticed is just how bad some of the paint applications are. At first I thought that maybe somebody had panel lined him, because if you can see here by his chin, there is a bit of a splotch of black paint there. And if you look here at the front of the mask, you can also see some additional paint splotches from the way that it's panel lined in the front. I can almost assure you that this thing was not panel lined by the person who bought it before me, because on the box it has all the same lines, and yet they look terrible in both the pictures and on the figure. Finally, if you take a look here at the shoulder where I'm focusing, there's some black lining in that, and if I opened him up, you'd be able to see just how sloppy some of that actually looks. It's a shame because everything else looks amazing, but then some of these strange minor details look awful on him. And that really sucks because I absolutely love the design of this thing. This thing looks completely badass. I mean, seriously, just look at how cool this thing looks. It really does hurt for me to have to say it sucks so bad. Getting it into this pose was incredibly difficult, but once I finally did, it looked so awesome. And this here is described as head mode, which of course is very aptly named. I honestly think this is really awesome looking. This makes it look almost entirely like a legendary samurai. It's giving me vibes of Yoshimitsu. And other figures in this same series have the same ability to turn into a head, but this one just really sticks out. Even if you didn't know what it was, this just looks really cool. But I will say that getting it into this pose was not easy. Transforming this thing was a pain in the butt, even with instructions. So let me show you what the biggest problem is with this figure. Unfortunately, the very back of it is just too heavy. This piece right here is posable, but the problem is that it's so heavy that it constantly weighs the figure back. There is a ball joint inside of here, which holds this piece, which acts like the chin of the mask here, but it also acts like the pelvis of the robot. Now this piece is supposed to come outward just a bit so that it can stand right, but because of this piece here, it's constantly weighed back because it's all sort of tied in the middle here. This constantly makes the back piece fall, meaning he can never really stand perfectly. Now this is also just a design problem, because if you move the shoulders a bit, there's huge gaps in the back, and personally for me that just makes it look terrible, because ultimately you're supposed to have this sitting back a little further, and that gap just looks awful. I even did a bit of tightening to the joints. I put some super glue on it, and I even put a piece of paper in there to try to stop it from moving, but unfortunately, because the mechanism in the center of it is so weak, it constantly falls backward. It's really unfortunate, and to be completely honest, it makes this figure a real pain to try to pose, so I think I'm going to end things here. All things considered, this is a wonderful looking figure. I absolutely love the design of it. Regardless of it having transformable parts and making it very gappy, I was able to look past that and say that still, from a visual aspect, this thing looked magnificent. The paint on this thing looks fantastic, but unfortunately, like I said, in some of the areas it almost looks as if a hobbyist went in and panel lined it themselves, and it's incredibly sloppy in other places. Ultimately, the quality control on this is garbage. The figure is incredibly weak in certain regions, and that creates a lot of problems with trying to pose it. The ball joints have gotten so weak and so useless that the shoulders constantly were falling off whenever I tried to pose this thing. Some joints are incredibly tight to the point of almost being inoperable, while others almost always fall off. It's just upsetting. Ultimately, if this is what the variable action series of figures has to offer from Megahouse, I would never buy another one of these so long as I live. I'm willing to bet that maybe just because these are Transformers, they have a little bit more problems than usual because they're a bit more like toys. But still, at the price point of this figure, this should not be so fragile. I'm wrapping this up early because there was so little that I could do with the figure that I don't want to break it, so I'm probably not going to keep this figure. I cannot recommend a purchase of this. As a collector, and as a hobbyist even, I would say that this figure fails on all fronts. It fails as a toy, it's not able to be a proper Transformer even because it's constantly falling apart, and ultimately as a figure it doesn't work either because it's almost completely unposable. There's a couple decent poses you can put the thing in, but good luck getting it in those without knocking parts off. And furthermore, this figure's almost impossible to find. I will give the Musyametal figure from Mado King Granzort a 4 out of 10, and it pains me to do so. The only points that it gets are in design alone. Visually, I do love this character, and I wish that it worked. Unfortunately, it just does not. As a figure, this is an absolute failure, and easily one of the worst figures I've ever reviewed in my series. But what do you guys think? Was I being too harsh on this thing? Personally, I think maybe I was because it was a Transformer, but either way, the thing just didn't work out right. Drop a comment below and tell me what you thought of this figure, and hey, if you did like it, make sure to like the video. I'm going to link something on screen for you guys to check out, so go ahead and click that. Even if you have seen it, it does help the channel. With all that said, thank you so much for watching, have an amazing weekend, and keep on collecting.